Dust rose on the horizon like a storm called forth from the earth itself. To weary Turkish gunners staring west across the Negev Desert on the afternoon of October 31st, 1917, it looked like another mirage. Heat bent the air, turning empty sand into shimmering illusions. For weeks, the men in the trenches had endured the blaze of the sun, the sting of grit in their eyes, and the numbing monotony of waiting. They had seen 100 mirages, but this one did not fade. It swelled, darkened, spread. Soon shapes began to form within it, long lines, dark silhouettes moving fast. A murmur spread through the Ottoman positions. The desert was not playing tricks. Something was coming, and it was coming with a speed that defied belief. That moment was the beginning of the last great cavalry charge in modern history. The First World War is often remembered for its endless trenches in France, for mud and barbed wire, for shells that chewed up men and landscapes alike. Yet the war stretched far beyond Europe. Under a scorching sun, in the deserts of Palestine, another front had been grinding on for years. Here the British Empire, aided by Australian and New Zealand troops, fought the Ottoman Turks, battle-hardened soldiers defending their empire with German officers and artillery at their side. This was a campaign where bullets and bayonets were matched by thirst, dust, and survival. Whoever controlled the wells controlled life itself. For Britain, the stakes in Palestine were enormous. The Suez Canal, the empire's lifeline to India and beyond, had to be secured. The Ottoman armies, allied with Germany, threatened it constantly. If the British broke through southern Palestine, they could safeguard the canal, open supply routes across the Sinai, and push north toward Damascus. But more than strategy hung in the balance. Jerusalem still lay under Ottoman control, a prize whose capture would echo across the world in pulpits, newspapers, and parliaments. For the Ottoman Empire, this fight was nothing less than a battle for survival. Palestine had been theirs for centuries. To lose it would not just mean ceding ground. It would expose Syria, unravel defenses, and erode what remained of their once mighty dominion. Humiliation before their allies and subjects would follow, and so they dug deep. With German guidance, they built trenches that curved across the ridges, machine guns with overlapping arcs of fire, artillery calibrated for every approach. They believed their positions secure. Cavalry, in their eyes, belonged to a bygone age. The campaign had already been marked by bitter failure. Twice in 1917 the British had hurled divisions against Gaza, and twice they had been repulsed. Thousands of men had died under relentless fire, and the front lines had not shifted an inch. Worse than defeat was what followed. Retreat across barren desert where wells were denied. Men collapsed with empty canteens, and horses fell with swollen tongues. In Palestine, failure was not just measured in casualties. It was measured in thirst. General Edmund Allenby, newly appointed commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, knew a fresh approach was needed. Gaza was too strong, too well defended. So he turned his eyes eastward, to Beersheba, a dusty town whose ancient wells had sustained life in the desert for millennia. Without Beersheba, his army could not advance. Without those wells, the desert itself would defeat them. The plan was daring. Strike Beersheba with speed, take the town before nightfall, and secure the wells intact. If successful, the entire Ottoman southern flank would unravel, leaving Gaza exposed. But the window was narrow. Allenby's men had already marched across the Sinai, their canteens nearly dry, their lips cracked with thirst. If the town was not captured before dark, the defenders would demolish the wells. No water, no campaign, no survival. Beersheba, however, was no easy target. 6 lines of trenches shielded the town. Machine guns covered every open approach, and artillery was dug into the rocky ridges. German engineers believed the defenses impregnable to anything short of a prolonged siege. Yet a siege was impossible. The army needed water today, not weeks from now. Allenby was gambling everything on speed and audacity, and into this desperate equation rode the Australians of the Light Horse. They were not conventional cavalry. They carried no sabers, no lances. Their doctrine was simple: ride swiftly to battle, then dismount and fight as infantry with rifles and bayonets. But they were men of the saddle, stockmen, farmers, sons of the outback. They had grown up in wide spaces where horse and rider were inseparable. Their mounts, the tough whalers, were bred for endurance under brutal conditions. For these men, horses were not just tools of war. They were comrades. And both man and beast had been pushed to the brink by days without enough water. The desert had hardened them. They had learned to sleep under the stars, brew tea over tiny fires, ride through dust storms for weeks at a time. Their humor was sharp, their discipline informal but rooted in trust. They cared for their animals as they cared for each other, rubbing their muzzles at night, sharing the last handful of grain. The bond was unspoken but absolute. The horse would carry the man into danger, and the man would carry the horse through hardship. Still, no bond could change the reality. The defenses around Beersheba were formidable. The sun was sliding lower, time running out. Inside the town, Ottoman engineers prepared explosives for the wells. If darkness came before the place was taken, water would vanish in plumes of dust and stone, and the men who had marched so far would have nothing to drink. By the afternoon of October 31st, the pressure was unbearable. Infantry had pressed forward. New Zealanders had fought bitterly for the stronghold of Tel El Saba, but the town itself remained in Ottoman hands. Progress was too slow. Allenby had to make a decision. The only force capable of moving fast enough was sitting on their horses, the Australian Light Horse. It was an option many considered madness. Cavalry had been shredded on the Western Front, cut down by barbed wire and machine guns. The textbooks all said the same: charges were suicide in the age of modern firepower. But the desert was not France. Here there was space, visibility, and the chance that speed itself could overwhelm the guns. If anyone could attempt it, it was the Light Horse. The order was given. Brigadier General William Grant, commanding the 4th and 12th Regiments, was to storm Beersheba before night fell. There would be no careful infantry assault, no slow grinding siege. The only hope was a full gallop across 6 kilometers of open ground, straight into trenches defended by rifles, artillery, and machine guns. As the men received the news, silence fell. Saddles were tightened, bayonets fixed to rifle muzzles, turning them into makeshift lances. Horses stamped and snorted, sensing the tension in their riders. Few words were spoken. The troopers knew the odds, but they were men who had spent lifetimes trusting horses to carry them through storms, and they were ready to try once more. The sun dipped toward the horizon, bathing the desert in crimson and gold. Dust clung to sweat-soaked uniforms, to the hides of restless whalers. Somewhere in the still air, a bugle waited to sound, and when it did, history would thunder forward. Orders spread through the ranks like a current through dry wire. Unseen, irresistible, transforming everything it touched. Mount up! The command snapped across the lines of the 4th and 12th Regiments, and men moved with the precision of long habit. They tightened girths, checked stirrups, adjusted straps. Bandoliers clinked faintly as they settled against chests. Then came the sharper order: fix bayonets. The long steel blades slid onto rifle muzzles with metallic clicks, turning rifles into awkward but deadly spears. They had no lances, no sabers gleamed in the sun, but steel at the end of a rifle would have to do. Across the battlefield, the Ottoman trenches snaked in jagged arcs across the stony plain. These were no hasty ditches. They had been dug deep and reinforced with sandbags and stone. German engineers had overseen their construction, teaching the defenders to overlap arcs of machine gun fire, to calculate artillery ranges, to prepare killing grounds for infantry attacks. The Turks expected another slow, grinding advance by foot soldiers. They did not imagine a storm of hooves. But the New Zealanders had already done their part, seizing the stronghold at Tel El Saba in the afternoon after bitter fighting. That opened a path, but time was slipping away. Inside Beersheba, engineers set fuses to charges placed near the wells. They knew the order could come at any moment. Destroy the water rather than let it fall into enemy hands. On the plain, the light horse assembled in 3 lines. A strange silence fell over the men. It was not fear, but concentration. In that hush, every small sound stood out. The creak of leather, the snort of a horse, the sharp tap of a trooper knocking his knuckles twice against a rifle stock for luck. Ahead of them lay 6 kilometers of open ground, flat, barren, exposed. No trees, no ridges to shelter behind, just sand and dust, leading straight into trenches bristling with rifles and guns. A bugle cut the air. The first line began to move. Hooves struck the ground in unison, kicking up dust that hung in the hot stillness. The formation rolled forward like a great machine. Walk, then trot, then a canter that built toward full gallop. Dust rose in clouds, shrouding the riders even as it announced their coming to every man watching from the trenches. At first, the Ottoman gunners struggled to believe what they were seeing. Cavalry, charging, straight at them. For a few stunned moments, disbelief slowed their response. Then the sky ripped open. Field guns roared. The first shells whined overhead, crashing down in explosions that blasted men and horses into the air. Columns of dirt and smoke punched holes in the advancing lines. Horses screamed as shrapnel tore into flesh. Riders tumbled, and dust swallowed them whole. But the charge did not falter. The survivors urged their mounts harder, filling the gaps, pressing forward. Machine guns rattled to life, their chatter sharp and merciless. Bullets hissed through the air, snapping past ears, punching into bodies, kicking up sand. Riders leaned low over their horses' necks, urging them to greater speed. Dust stung eyes and throats. The ground trembled beneath the pounding of hundreds of hooves. What should have been an impossible advance became a blur of motion too fast for the defenders to adjust. The Turks had prepared to fight infantry creeping forward at a crawl, but the Australians gave them no time. They came on like a storm, bayonets catching the last light of the setting sun, rifles raised, eyes narrowed against dust and fire. As the distance closed, panic rippled through the trenches. Gunners struggled to depress their barrels low enough to catch the riders. Horses leapt over barbed wire, hooves clashing against wooden stakes, sparks flying. Men fired from the saddle, some thrusting bayonets downward like lances as they cleared the first trenches. The earth itself seemed to convulse as the light horse slammed into the defenses. Trenches designed to hold infantry became traps for their own defenders. Horses bounded over them, riders vaulting from the saddle to plunge into the earthworks with rifles blazing. Shock spread like fire. Some Ottoman soldiers fought fiercely, firing until the last possible moment. Others threw down their weapons and fled toward the town. Panic spread faster than orders could contain it. Within minutes, the impossible was happening. The trench lines, thought impregnable, were breached. Chaos rolled through the Ottoman positions as Australians poured in, relentless, unstoppable. But Beersheba itself still loomed ahead. The wells still waited, charges set and ready to blow. And the Australians knew. They had to reach them before darkness, before the fuses were lit, before thirst claimed them all. The charge had only just begun. The final stretch into Beersheba was chaos and thunder. Dust cloaked the field, turning the battlefield into a world of shadows and flashes. The first trenches had been crossed, overrun in a storm of hooves and steel. But the Australians did not stop. They pressed forward, racing toward the heart of the Ottoman defenses and the town beyond. Machine gun crews scrambled to reorient their weapons, but the riders were too fast. Guns meant to sweep broad fields of infantry could not lower their barrels quickly enough to cut down men charging from horseback at a full gallop. Horses leapt wire, crashed through obstacles, and pounded straight over trenches, their riders firing rifles one-handed, bayonets glinting like lances in the fading light. In some sectors, Ottoman resistance collapsed almost instantly. In others, defenders fought desperately, firing until they were overrun. A machine gun nest held out until a rider thrust his bayonet down into the belt, jamming the weapon into silence. Another trench erupted into hand-to-hand combat as dismounted troopers vaulted in, fighting with rifles, pistols, and steel. The earth shook with the struggle, dust choking lungs, the smell of gunpowder burning in every breath. But speed was everything. The Australians did not allow the defense to recover. They leapt trench after trench, pushed through layer after layer of fortifications, until at last the outer lines broke apart. Ottoman soldiers abandoned their guns, fled into the town, or simply threw down their weapons in surrender. The shock was too great, the momentum too overwhelming. And then, through smoke and dust, the town itself appeared. Beersheba lay ahead. Its low, square houses, its winding streets, its heart still guarded by a final line of trenches. Beyond those streets lay the true prize, the wells. If the engineers destroyed them before the Australians arrived, all would be lost. The 4th and 12th regiments stormed into the outskirts, their horses carrying them straight through alleys and courtyards. Troopers dismounted and fought house to house, clearing pockets of resistance, shouting orders above the din. In one street, an officer rallied his men only to watch them scatter as riders burst through a barricade in a cloud of dust and gunfire. In another, a handful of Turkish soldiers fired wildly from a rooftop before melting away into the maze of streets. At the wells, engineers worked frantically. Charges had been laid, wires strung. The order to ignite them hung in the air, but the Australians arrived first. A small party of engineers and troopers cut the fuses, tore away explosives, and secured the sites. Buckets were lowered into the depths, ropes burning raw hands as they hauled water up. The first splash of cold, clear water broke the spell of dust and fire. Horses thrust their heads into troughs, snorting, pawing, drinking with desperate gulps. Men fell to their knees, cupped hands trembling as they drank greedily, water spilling down dust-caked faces. Some wept openly, tears mixing with the grime of battle. Victory, survival, and relief became one. By nightfall, Beersheba was in Allied hands. The Australians had done the unthinkable. In less than an hour, they had ridden across 6 kilometers of open desert under modern firepower, breached 6 lines of trenches, and captured a fortified town. The wells stood intact. The gamble had paid off. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. With Beersheba fallen, the Ottoman southern flank had collapsed. Within days, Gaza, long thought impregnable, was abandoned. Within weeks, the road to Jerusalem lay open. And in December 1917, British forces marched into the Holy City, a moment celebrated across the Allied world. Strategically, the victory shifted the entire campaign. Symbolically, it electrified the Allies with proof that daring and speed still had a place in a war dominated by machines. For the Australians, the memory of that evening would never fade. They spoke of the thunder of hooves vibrating through their chests, of shells screaming overhead, of dust that blinded and suffocated. They remembered the leap over trenches, the shock in the defenders' eyes, and the taste of cold water after days of thirst. Against every lesson of modern warfare, they had charged and prevailed. Historians would later call it the last great cavalry charge of the modern age. Never again would horses decide a battle against entrenched modern firepower. Tanks, planes, and mechanized warfare would soon dominate the battlefield. But on that October day in 1917, the horse had one final triumph to give. Decades later, veterans recalled the silence that followed the battle. It was not the silence of death, but of awe, the realization that they had done the impossible. When asked why they charged, one trooper gave an answer as simple as it was profound. "We rode for water, and we rode for each other." Today, Beersheba remembers. Bronze statues stand in the desert, riders frozen mid-gallop, dust swirling forever around iron hooves. Visitors stand before them, trying to imagine the thunder of 800 horses breaking into a gallop across 6 kilometers of open ground. In the desert wind, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo of hooves, the last great cry of the age of cavalry.